Welcome to this online lesson asking the question, why was there so little change in medicine in the Middle Ages? Our aim is quite simple, to support a judgment by applying knowledge of a topic. We're going to be doing this through an extended exam answer. This is going to be an opportunity to practice those dreaded 16-mark essays, but there's no reason that they should be dreaded. With a bit of practice and a bit of knowledge, you can get to grips with them and get really good marks. Okay, so let's look at how we're going to structure today's lesson. Firstly, a do now task to lead us in. This should be based upon your existing knowledge of the topic. Answer each of these questions. You can always pause after each question is asked, or wait till I've asked them all, pause it then and do them all at once. Question 1. How was a urine chart used? Question 2. Why might one use leeches in the Middle Ages? Number 3. What is the name of something that will make you vomit? Number 4. Spell the name for a medieval chemist. We're talking apothecary. Number 5. Give 2 examples of superstition in the Middle Ages. Number 6. Astrology was used to do what? Spell another word for bad air. We're talking miasma. And who lived in the monasteries? Pause the video, complete those questions, and then we'll have a look at some answers. Correct any answers that you get wrong. Urine charts were used to diagnose illness and treatment of disease. If you explained how that was used by referring to urine colour and things like that, you can have the mark. Leeches were used to draw blood from a patient. Purging is the name given to those medicines that make you sick. That's the spelling of apothecary. Believing in witchcraft, astrology, supernatural ideas, God, any of those can be considered those superstitions. Study of the planets and its effect on humans is what we mean by astrology. There's the spelling of miasma, and monks or nuns are who lives in a monastery. Okay, pause the video while you do some corrections. That's if you need to. If you don't, well done. Let's think about the concept of progress. Think about medicine in the medieval period. Would you say that there was progress? Progress can be shown on a continuum a little bit like this. You might want to note down your own copy. At one extreme, we could say that there was no change or little change. Then we might say that there was some change, and then at the other end we would say that there was massive change. Where would you place your mark if you were to place a mark on here for how much progress or change there was in the Middle Ages? Now, if you place your mark further down towards little change, that shows that this is a period of continuity. In other words, things are continuing in the same way. There's very little progress and very little change. On the other hand, if there was massive change or massive progress and you've put your mark down here, then you would argue that this is not a period of continuity, this is a period of change. So, now we've had a look at that, give some basic definitions for both the words change and continuity. I'm sure change is one that you'll find pretty easy, you're probably already familiar with it, but continuity is a word you might be more unfamiliar with. But look for the clue, it almost contains the word continue, so it's the idea that things continue in the same way. Pause the video while you note down your definitions. We're going to have a look at 5 so-called fantastic factors today. Factors are reasons that things are affected, maybe progressing or regressing in medicine. The 5 factors we're going to study are the church, government, which in the Middle Ages really would just mean the king, and maybe the odd local council, individuals like Hippocrates and Galen, and education. And lastly, attitudes. In the Middle Ages, this really refers to respect for tradition, or the old ideas that people followed. We're going to make some revision index cards now. We have looked at this before in an earlier lesson, so if you're new to this process and you want to have a more detailed description of how to do this, have a look at lesson 2 in this playlist, which I've linked in the description. The Understanding the Middle Ages lesson will have some better details on how to create your cards. Anyway, if you're comfortable with how to make them, here's what you're going to do. Take 5 index cards, which remember you can just make out of bits of paper, and on one side write down one factor, and on the other side you'll need to use the information from these slides to build your knowledge. You'll need to include on each card examples of how each factor meant there was little change in medicine in the Middle Ages. Aim for minimum 3 examples per card. An explanation of how much change or continuity this led to. So in other words, did this particular factor lead to things staying the same, continuity, or did it mean that things weren't the same, change? Then lastly, an overall judgment about how important this factor is in the history of medicine. Is it a little important, partly, very, whatever you think. By all means, take some brief notes of these instructions as they're about to disappear off the screen as we look at our first index card topic. And again, I remind you, if you are unfamiliar with this process, check out my earlier video and you'll be able to get some better instructions. Let's create our first card. Start by adding the title, The Church, to one side of your card. Once you've done that, you can start adding details like this. The Bible taught that God controlled all aspects of life, both good and bad. They used God to explain bad harvests and death of animals, so believing God sent disease too was obvious. People believed diseases were a punishment from God for their sins, or were God testing their faith. The prior of Christchurch Abbey said in 1348, God used suffering to drive out the numberless sins of the people. Of course, the significance of that date is that's when the Black Death arrived in England. The church also controlled education. The ideas used by physicians were based on the work of ancients like Galen and Hippocrates. Not only did people not try to find new ideas, but the church encouraged them not to, and could persecute or treat badly people who thought differently, accusing them of heresy. Heresy would be a crime against the church, and it could carry very heavy penalties, including death. Okay, pause the video here, make the relevant notes, remember at least 3 more if you can manage it. Say whether this is more a representation of change or continuity, and then decide how important you think this was overall. Pause the video while you complete your first of 5 cards. On to the next. Government. Write government on one side of your next card. The king was the head of the government in medieval England and was usually more preoccupied with war and taxation. Most responsibilities to do with medicine were left to the church. However, in times of crisis, the king may act by issuing writs or orders to local governors such as sheriffs. For example, quarantine rules were introduced in the Black Death by Edward III, who's pictured. A man who knew all too well the dangers of this, as he sadly lost his favourite daughter to the disease. More locally, town and city councils ordered latrines to be built and issued fines for public health violations like polluting water and littering. Overall, though, governments tended to react to events rather than plan for the future. Pause the video here, make your notes, decide whether this is more change or more continuity, and decide overall how important it is. Pause the video while you complete card 2. On to card number 3. Card 3, individuals. Add that heading to one side of your index card. There were few, if any, significant medical individuals in Christian medieval Europe. Instead, the church and the universities that they controlled taught physicians the work of the ancient Greek Hippocrates and the ancient Roman Galen. Sticking to these old ideas meant that there was little attempt to find new ideas or make scientific breakthroughs. However, during the time of the Crusades, this was a series of religious wars in the so-called Holy Land or Middle East between the Christians from Europe and the Middle Eastern Islamic civilizations, Christians came into contact with the work of Islamic doctors like Ibn Sina and al-Razi. They gave them Europeanized names, Avicenna and Razis. These individuals introduced some new ideas, but even their work was largely based upon the work of the ancients, including translating some of Galen and Hippocrates' books. Okay, for task number 3, or card number 3 rather, pause the video now, make the notes that you need to, say whether this is more change or more continuity, it might be a bit of both, and then say how important you think this was overall. Pause the video while you complete that. Done? Well, we're halfway there, a little bit over anyway. But are we living on a prayer? Education was largely controlled by the church. Make sure you've written education on one side of your index cards. What little local education there was tended to be in basic literacy, usually led by a parish priest. Others may have gone to a grammar school if they were wealthy enough, again run by the church, to learn Latin grammar. Often people who learnt Latin grammar were hoping to become priests themselves. The most educated, such as physicians, went to the church universities such as Oxford and Cambridge. These focused their teaching on the ancients rather than finding new ideas. A medieval university is shown in the picture. You can see that they're reading the text there, and they're simply being lectured on them there. They're not really doing much in terms of investigation. The church did not allow human dissection. Instead, the work of Galen was used without questioning his accuracy. This meant that many mistakes were carried over for centuries. You know the drill by now. Make the notes that you need to. Decide whether this is more change or more continuity, and then decide how important it was overall. Pause the video while you complete card number 4. Lastly, attitudes. What a weird picture, although you might be able to tell who these people are. These symbols represent the signs of the zodiac. Medieval attitudes tended to be both conservative, meaning that they wanted to preserve old ideas or respecting the way that things were at the time, and superstitious, believing in religious and supernatural ideas. They respected and followed the teachings of the Bible and of the classical or ancient civilizations, the Greeks and the Romans especially. They believed in the supernatural, like witchcraft, luck and astrology. In the 14th century, astrology was a key part of medical training, and physicians used planetary movements and zodiac signs in their treatment. These were already ancient ideas. Okay, for the last time, take the notes that you need to. Is this more change or more continuity? And decide how important it was overall. Pause the video while you complete this. Done? Let's move on. Before we attempt the exam style question, we're going to do some following up tasks to help organise our thoughts. It's time to begin applying the knowledge that we've gained. Firstly, arrange your factors from most to least important. Then write down a brief explanation for which was the most important with an example, and then consider your most important factors, i.e. the top 2 to 3. Are they more examples of continuity, or are they more examples of change? Explain why. Then give 3 examples of continuity and 3 examples of change if you can find them. From this, we actually have the early beginnings of an exam style answer. Pause the video while you complete these tasks. On to the exam style answer then. You might want to write this down. Normally you wouldn't have to because of course it would be printed in the exam, but if you want to do any underlining or highlighting of parts of this question, it would be a good idea to have a copy. It starts with a statement. There was more change than continuity in the medicine during the Middle Ages. How far do you agree with this view? Explain your answer. In a very simple sense, you can either agree with that, disagree with that, or partly agree with that. But just doing that's only going to get you about 1 mark out of the total of 16 that would be available for this sort of essay style question. So you're going to need to show both sides here. Fortunately, the Edexcel exam board have decided kindly to give you some extra information. You may use the following in your answer. The church, governments. Lo and behold, those are 2 of the headings that you've got on your revision cards. So as long as you've absorbed and you've understood that, you should be able to start your answer. But you won't get all of your marks for just doing that. You must also use information of your own. Now the 16 marks that this question would hold actually have 10 marks for your explanation and 6 marks for your knowledge. But you must use some of your own knowledge to get the full 6 marks for your knowledge. And for the 10 marks, you've got to be constantly arguing. In what ways might you agree with that statement? In what ways might you disagree with that statement? And finally, how far do you agree overall? And that how far phrase is particularly important. It's not just I totally agree or I totally disagree necessarily. You might agree partly or you might agree in some ways but not in others. This can be quite complicated, so I'm going to give you some detailed instructions on to how to answer this, but if you're confident with writing essays, you can ignore this and crack straight on with that answer. You'll want to spend anything between 25 minutes to half an hour writing it, and if you finish much sooner than that, chances are you've not written enough. However, if you're wanting some help on how to answer this, this is a suggestion. It's not going to get you a perfect answer, but it is going to get you started. Firstly, use a series of PEAL paragraphs. Firstly, for your argument. PEAL stands for point, example, explain and link. And remember, you've got to be linking back to whether or not you agree with that statement. So firstly, we'll see what examples agree with that statement. In some ways there was change in medieval medicine. An example of this was, the effect of this was or this involved, and this supports the view that there was more change than continuity because. Now you'll want to explain more than one example here very likely, but you might not just leave it there, particularly if you disagree with the view. Here's where you bring in some evaluation. Now this is one of the trickier skills that we have. However, I agree or disagree with this view because this is where you start to say, well, look, I recognise that there may be historians out there that have a particular point of view, but I don't necessarily agree with this because of the following reasons. So it is possible and in fact necessary for you to recognise views that are other than your own, but you can still go and argue against them. Yes, I realise that's a little bit tricky. You might find it more understandable when you see a sample answer later on. So once you've made your argument, or an argument, you can give the other side to it. This is known as the counter argument. Again, you make your point, you give an example, you explain, you link back, and you evaluate. On the other hand, in some ways there was continuity in medieval medicine. And then you continue as above, you give an example, you explain what that involved, you say whether that supports or goes against the view, and then you can say whether you agree or disagree with that. Lastly, you conclude. You say whether overall you agree, you disagree to an extent, to a large extent, to a small extent, whatever. But don't just leave it at that. You've then got to support it with examples and reasons why. Typically in a conclusion, you won't bring much new into the answer, but you will sort of summarise and bring together the points that you've already made, which really demonstrate that you have backed up your point of view. And you must say how far you either agree with that statement that there was more change than continuity, or whether you disagree because you think there was more continuity than change. That's tricky. So you are going to need between 25 minutes and half an hour to complete it. You can pause this video here, and I encourage you to have this at full screen so you can see the text nice and clearly. If you're completely at sea, or if you finished your answer, we'll move on to an example answer that I've written. Not a perfect answer, but it will show you how you can use this structure to produce a pretty convincing answer. Pause the video while you complete the task. Now, if you've done that right, your hand should be aching now. Give it a rest and have a look at my example. This is such a long example, I'm going to have to split it over a couple of screens. But I will give up a version of it at the end which shows the entire answer that you can pause and study at your leisure, particularly if it's full screen. I've colour coded here with red for my points, blue for my examples, green for my explanations, purple for my links, and any evaluation I've done I've tended to do in black if it's separate to the rest of the work. If you actually put the headings point, example, explain and link into your answer, it looks really amateurish, so don't. You will often get 4 marks for spelling, punctuation and grammar attached to these answers, although not always, so it's really important to write in proper paragraphs with the very best punctuation and spelling that you can. Here's my first paragraph, showing one side of the argument. You might actually be used to including an introduction here. I've skipped that for the time being because as long as my conclusion is strong I can still pick up the marks. But you can gain some early marks just by saying right off the off whether or not you agree or disagree with the statement. In some ways there was change in medieval medicine. For example, governments took some control over public health in a way that they hadn't before. This resulted in laws and rules to prevent the littering and polluting of streets and water sources in towns and cities. This supports the view that there was more change and continuity as it shows that people were understanding the link between clean living conditions and public health. Another example was that doctors were now educated in universities run by the church. This meant that physicians had formal medical training and were recognised for their qualifications. This supports the view that there was more change and continuity because it shows that physicians were now more formally trained and qualified, unlike unqualified healers like apothecaries. However, in some ways these examples also show continuity. This is where I'm evaluating. The public health measures in towns are often a reaction to a problem rather than showing detailed knowledge and planning, and most doctors learned about the ancient ideas of Hippocrates and Galen, which shows a continuity of old ideas. So although I've given one side to the argument here, because I ultimately disagree with that argument, you might not, but because I do, I then undermined it deliberately by evaluating it and saying, look, I recognise this view, but I don't agree with it myself. And that's going to pick up loads of those AO2 marks for analysis. On the other hand, counter-argument coming in, there was lots of continuity in medieval medicine. For example, the church controlled many aspects of education and medical belief at this time and discouraged new ideas. This resulted in physicians believing in the ideas of Galen and Hippocrates even when their ideas were inaccurate, such as the idea of the four humours. This challenges the view that there was more change in continuity, as it shows that it was very difficult for new ideas and discoveries to be created in medieval times. Another example is that the Middle Ages were highly superstitious. Physicians also believed in ideas such as astrology for explaining disease. This challenges the view that there was more change in continuity because it shows that medical ideas remained rooted in very ancient ideas. This is more significant than examples of change, as conservative medieval attitudes meant people accepted old ideas almost without question. Okay, so far then, I've given one side to it where I'm showing the ways in which I might agree with the original statement. Now I've gone into more of my argument, showing how actually I think that there was more continuity, so I disagree. But I've not concluded yet, so let's have a look at that last paragraph. In conclusion, I disagree with the view that there was more change in continuity in medieval times, to a large extent. That's crucial because I've shown how far I agree, and in fact I'm saying I disagree quite a lot. The control of the church and loyalty that medieval physicians and people had to often very ancient ideas shows that tradition was more important than new discoveries to them. This shows that ancient, often incorrect ideas were held on to for hundreds of years with little change, as the church had such a hold over knowledge and education. This challenges the view that there was more change, as even small examples of change, such as university education, were founded on ideas of continuity. While there were changes in belief, such as the introduction of Arabic teachings by people like Avicenna, even these new ideas tended to be based on more ancient ideas from ancient Greece and Rome. So there we go. Hopefully in my conclusion I've demonstrated just why I think there's so much more continuity than change, and therefore I disagree with the statement. And I've been clear on that right at the start of that conclusion, so the examiner is left in no doubt as to what my view is. Okay, you can pause the video here and add to your conclusion if you need to. But in a moment, I'm going to show you the whole answer on one screen. The text will be pretty small, but if you are able to watch this full screen, you should be able to read it and make any necessary improvements to your text. I'm just about losing my voice here, so I'm not going to read it again, but here is the answer in full. Again, I'm not saying that's perfect, but it gives you a pretty good breakdown as how you can give one side of the argument, the other side, and then a conclusion. Make any improvements that you want to. Otherwise, that's the end of this lesson. And indeed the end of this first unit on medieval medicine. Next we'll be looking at the era of the Renaissance, when more scientific ideas finally begin to take over. But on that note, I'll say thank you for watching. I hope it's been useful and interesting, and if it has, give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. But for now, I'll say goodbye and good health.